Often following a heart procedure like a stent placement or a bypass surgery or even a valve replacement, we may be told by our physician to follow a cardiac diet or a heart healthy diet. Sometimes patients hear the words low cholesterol diet, low fat diet, or even no sodium diet. Today we'll look at what does it mean when we say heart healthy diet. We will be looking at the American Heart Association's Dietary Guidelines for a healthy pattern of eating to promote heart health. There are several risk factors that increase your likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease. Some of these risk factors, like family history or age, we can't change or control. Other risk factors we can change or influence, and they include whether or not we smoke, how well our blood pressure is managed, our cholesterol levels, our weight, how much we exercise and our activity level, as well as the foods that we put in our body. And a healthy diet and lifestyle, like exercising regularly and choosing to not smoke, are some of the best weapons we can use to fight cardiovascular disease. And the good news is, it's not as hard as you think. The Heart Healthy Dietary Pattern focuses on reducing 3 particular risk factors for heart disease. A heart healthy diet can help lower your LDL cholesterol. It also can help lower your blood pressure and promote a healthy body weight. So let's take a look at each of those 3 risk factors. An elevated cholesterol level is one of the major controllable risk factors for heart disease, heart attack, and stroke. When you get your cholesterol level checked, it's called a lipid profile or panel, and it includes your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglyceride levels. These are all measured in milligrams per deciliter. Cholesterol is a waxy substance that's found in all of your cells and has several useful functions in the body. Your liver makes cholesterol, and it makes all of the cholesterol your body needs. Cholesterol is carried through the bloodstream attached to proteins. These are called lipoproteins. So when you hear the term LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, this is actually referring to the cholesterol carriers. When you have elevated levels of low-density lipoprotein in your blood, it can join with fats and other substances to build up in the inner walls of your arteries and narrow the passageways. Sometimes a clot can form and get stuck in the narrowed space, causing a heart attack or stroke. This is why LDL cholesterol is often referred to as bad cholesterol. Population studies show lower rates of heart disease in adult populations where the LDL concentration is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. If you're considered a high-risk patient, your doctor may want to be more aggressive in lowering your LDL concentration. If you've had multiple cardiovascular events in the past, or have multiple risk factors such as diabetes, high blood pressure, smoking, strong family history, your doctor may want to keep that LDL concentration less than 70. HDL cholesterol, or high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, refers to those carriers that we call good cholesterol. Your HDL cholesterol picks up excess cholesterol as it goes through the bloodstream and takes it back to your liver, where it's broken down and removed from the body. When it comes to HDL cholesterol, the higher numbers are better. We are considered at risk for heart disease if our HDL cholesterol is less than 40 milligrams per deciliter in men or less than 50 milligrams per deciliter in women. Women tend to have higher HDL levels. That's why there's a difference in the goals here. If our HDL level is above 60 milligrams per deciliter, that's considered desirable and it almost has like a protective effect on our heart. The triglyceride levels are a type of fat or lipid found in your blood. When you eat, your body converts any calories it doesn't need to use right away into triglycerides or fat. The triglycerides are stored in your fat cells. Later, hormones release the triglycerides for energy in between meals. If you regularly eat more calories than you burn, particularly from high carbohydrate or high sugar foods, you may have high triglyceride levels. High triglyceride levels can also be caused by diabetes, smoking, and being overweight. A high triglyceride level combined with a high LDL or low HDL is linked to plaque buildup within the artery walls. There are several factors that can influence your cholesterol level. Some of the factors we can control and others we cannot. Things outside of our control that affect our cholesterol levels include our age and our gender, as well as our family history. As women and men get older, our cholesterol levels tend to rise. Before the age of menopause, women have lower total cholesterol levels than men of the same age. However, after the age of menopause, women tend to see a rise in their LDL concentration. Family history plays a role as well. Your genes partly determine how much cholesterol your liver makes. So high blood cholesterol can run in families. There are lots of factors that can affect our cholesterol level that we can control, including our weight. Being overweight is a risk factor for heart disease. It also tends to increase your cholesterol. Losing weight can help lower your LDL, lower your total cholesterol, and your triglyceride levels. It also can raise the good cholesterol or the HDL level. Losing as little as 5% of your body weight can help lower cholesterol levels. For someone who weighs 200 pounds, that's just a 10-pound weight loss. Weight loss combined with a healthy diet can lower LDL levels by as much as 30%, which is similar to taking a cholesterol-lowering medication. Our physical activity level is also going to influence our cholesterol level. Not exercising regularly and being sedentary is a risk factor for heart disease. Regular physical exercise and activity can lower LDL concentrations and raise HDL concentrations. It can also help you lose weight. You should aim for 40 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity 3 to 4 times per week. Sometimes we are prescribed a cholesterol-lowering medication to help lower our cholesterol levels. A group of medicines called statins can help lower the LDL concentration. High-intensity statins, such as Lipitor or Crestor, can reduce LDL levels by greater than 50%. There are other statin medications that are considered low to moderate intensity and would lower that cholesterol level less dramatically. Of course, our diet also is going to influence our cholesterol level. Saturated fat and trans fats found in our food can make cholesterol levels rise. Saturated fat and trans fats cause your liver to make more cholesterol than it otherwise would. Reducing the amount of saturated fat in your diet helps lower your blood cholesterol level. A diet high in fiber can also help. Having high blood pressure levels, or hypertension, is another risk factor for heart disease that can be influenced by our dietary choices. Blood pressure is a measure of the force of blood against the artery walls. The top number, the systolic pressure, is the pressure as the heart beats and blood is being pushed through the artery. The bottom number, or the diastolic pressure, is the pressure against the artery walls when the heart relaxes in between heartbeats. Elevated blood pressure levels can damage the cells of the inner lining of the artery walls, increasing the likelihood of plaque buildup. High blood pressure also makes the heart have to work harder than it should. Uncontrolled hypertension is also the number one risk factor for having a stroke and can also lead to kidney disease. You can see the normal blood pressure levels as well as elevated and different levels of hypertension identified on the chart on the screen. There are many risk factors that will increase your likelihood of developing high blood pressure. Some, again, are risk factors we can't control, like our age and our family history, as well as race. But there are also risk factors for developing hypertension that we do have control over, like our activity level. People who are sedentary, as well as people who are overweight or obese, are much more likely to develop hypertension than people who exercise regularly and maintain a healthy body weight. Excessive alcohol intake and excessive sodium intake also increases our risk for developing high blood pressure. Obesity is such a significant risk factor that often I see patients be able to decrease or even discontinue their blood pressure medications when they lose a modest amount of weight. Age is also a significant risk factor. While 1 in 3 Americans are affected by hypertension in America, when we look specifically at age groups, the prevalence increases as we get older. More than 60% of adults over the age of 60 have hypertension. While limiting sodium intake in our diet can help control high blood pressure, even individuals who do not have hypertension can benefit from a lower sodium diet. I am often asked the question, I don't have high blood pressure. Why do I have to pay attention to sodium? And my answer is we should all be paying attention to sodium. There are many sources of excessive sodium in the typical American diet. And by eating a healthy dietary pattern and avoiding excessive sodium intake, we may be able to prevent or at least delay the onset of hypertension that often occurs as we get older. The American Heart Association provides several diet and lifestyle recommendations to help reduce these risk factors of obesity, elevated cholesterol levels, and hypertension. The first recommendation is to stay at a healthy body weight by balancing the amount of calories you eat with the activity you do every day. If we consistently consume more calories than our body uses, we will experience weight gain. Appropriate calorie balance can be achieved by practicing portion control and by balancing higher and lower calorie density foods. Physical activity can also be increased to burn more calories throughout the day. This idea of calorie density and calorie balance is a topic we discuss extensively in the weight management class. The Heart Healthy Diet also includes a variety of nutritious foods from all the food groups. Food choices should be nutrient dense and provide the vitamins and minerals as well as protein and fiber that our bodies need to function properly. Now, there may be limitations within each food group to help meet the overall guidelines for limiting saturated fat and sodium, but there are no food groups that are eliminated in the Heart Healthy Diet. Nutrient-poor foods, or foods that provide excessive calories, sodium, saturated fat, or added sugar, are limited in the Heart Healthy Diet. Since it would be impossible to avoid all saturated fat and sodium, it is helpful to be aware of specific amounts that can be included in our diet while still maintaining an overall healthy dietary pattern. To lower LDL concentrations, the American Heart Association recommends reducing daily saturated fat intake to less than 5 to 6% of your total calories. Now, I'll admit this is a somewhat confusing way to state this limit because when we look at a nutrition label, saturated fat is listed in grams, not a percentage of our calories. So to convert this recommendation to grams, we can look at average calorie intakes, figure the percentage, and divide by calories per gram. And once we complete this math, the recommendation boils down to approximately 12 to 15 grams of saturated fat per day being our daily limit. Now, this is based on your calorie needs. So those with lower calorie intake should aim for 12 grams, and those with higher calories could consume a little bit more like 15 grams of saturated fat per day. Now, when we lower our intake of a specific nutrient, such as saturated fat, we will likely increase our intake of another nutrient to replace it. And what we replace the saturated fat with is very important. If I lower my saturated fat intake, but replace it with simple carbohydrates, such as white bread or sugars, I will actually be worse off and potentially see an increase in my health risks. Even replacing saturated fat with whole grains only provides a small health benefit. Where we see the most significant reduction in cardiovascular disease is when we lower our saturated fat intake and replace it with unsaturated fats. We will be looking at sources of unsaturated and saturated fats from each food group in just a minute. But a general rule is that fats that come from an animal will be higher in saturated fat. Now, the exception to that rule is fish. Fat from fish is higher in the unsaturated fats, but most of your other animal fats are high in saturated fat, where plant fats, like olive oil or nuts or an avocado, tend to be higher in unsaturated fats. So an example of this replacing that I'm talking about would be if we replaced our usual choice of steak or beef, which is higher in saturated fat, with wild-caught salmon. Both choices have fat, but the salmon is lower in saturated fat and high in omega-3s, which is a polyunsaturated fat. The American Heart Association also provides recommendations regarding sodium intake. Now, sodium is an essential nutrient. Your body needs a minimum of about 500 milligrams of sodium per day for cellular function. So no one should be on a no sodium diet. We may, however, be on a no salt diet. It is recommended that everyone limit their sodium intake to 2,300 milligrams or less per day. This is a recommendation from the American Heart Association as well as from the government for individuals that don't even have heart disease. The AHA also provides a second recommendation. They say that 1,500 milligrams of sodium or less is ideal, especially for individuals with high blood pressure or fluid retention issues. Now, sodium occurs naturally in most foods. Even fresh vegetables contain small amounts of sodium. But I'm not worried about the sodium that occurs naturally in food, because when it occurs naturally, it is usually in relatively small amounts. However, when sodium is added to foods, either by the salt shaker at the table, or when we're cooking, or especially during food processing, then the sodium occurs in larger amounts. It is estimated that processed foods provide about 75% of the sodium we take in. Sodium is added during processing for flavor or as a preservative. And what about sugar? We may not be thinking about limiting our sugar in a heart-healthy diet, especially if we do not have diabetes. However, added sugar provides a lot of calories without any important nutrition. So the American Heart Association recommends that men limit added sugars to 36 grams or less per day, and women limit added sugars to 25 grams per day. Now notice this recommendation applies to added sugars as opposed to naturally occurring sugars. Some sugars occur naturally in foods, like fructose in fruit and lactose in milk. In fact, if you look at the nutrition label on a gallon of milk, you'll see that there's 11 or 12 grams of sugar. Now, nobody poured sugar into that gallon of milk. That's just the lactose that occurs naturally. Now, the difference between added and natural sugars is when I consume sugars that occur naturally in milk or fruit, I'm also getting a lot of other important nutrients from that food. So when I consume those 12 grams of sugar from milk, I'm also getting 8 grams of protein, about 30% of my calcium needs, some potassium, some riboflavin, and even vitamin D. Now, if I get sugar from a Coca-Cola, that comes from added sugars, high fructose corn syrup, I don't get any important nutrients. That's why the added sugar is what we're limiting. So what does 36 grams or 25 grams really look like? Well, a tablespoon of sugar has 12 grams of sugar in it, and a teaspoon of sugar has 4 grams. So if I put a teaspoon of sugar in my coffee in the morning, that's only 4 grams of sugar, and I'm allowed about 25 grams for the day. So I'm doing okay. Now, if I have 4 cups of coffee throughout the day, and I also put a little bit of sugar in my tea, and I have a Nutri-Grain bar as a mid-afternoon snack, then I've exceeded my sugar limit. Sugar adds up very quickly in added foods, and even foods like that Nutri-Grain bar I just mentioned have more added sugar than we would probably expect. A Nutri-Grain bar, which I don't consider a sugary dessert, has 12 grams of added sugar in it. So while 25 grams or 36 grams does allow us to include some sugars to improve palatability of foods and make our foods taste good and sweet, it does limit how much we should add. And by checking labels, we can see how close we get to that limit. The final dietary recommendation is to consume alcohol in moderation. While small amounts of alcohol, such as red wine, can have some health benefits, larger amounts can have a negative impact on our health. Moderation with alcohol is defined as 2 drinks or less a day for a man, 1 drink or less a day for a woman, and a drink is defined as 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor, or 1 ounce of 100 proof liquor. To achieve these daily limits that we've been talking about, we're going to take a look at each food group and the recommended number of servings from food groups. We're going to start with the most important food group in my opinion, and that's fruits and vegetables. The recommended number of servings of fruits and vegetables is 7 to 10 servings per day. That's a lot. Often we're not even close to that number. So patients can often have a goal to increase their intake of fruits and vegetables. Now let's look at what a serving is. This is going to help us get to that 7 to 10 goal a little bit easier. A serving of raw leafy vegetables is 1 cup. If it's a raw cut-up vegetable like baby carrots or broccoli, or even a cooked vegetable, it's a 1/2 cup. Same thing with fruit. A 1/2 cup of grapes or a 1/2 cup of sliced strawberries would be 1 serving. So if I have a bowl of strawberries and it's a cup of sliced strawberries, that's actually 2 servings, even though it's just 1 bowl. Now the reason we emphasize fruits and vegetables so much and have so many servings is that these foods are naturally low in those nutrients we're trying to limit. They're low in sodium and saturated fat and calories, but they are very nutrient dense, meaning they have a lot of vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and other important things that our body needs. Fruits and vegetables are specifically high in potassium and magnesium, which are both minerals that can help lower your blood pressure. They're also rich in fiber, which can help lower our cholesterol levels. And our non-starchy vegetables are our lowest calorie density food group. So when we're trying to lose weight, we can really emphasize those non-starchy vegetables. Now, if we do have diabetes, we want to remember that fruit will affect our blood glucose levels much more than those non-starchy vegetables. So if you have diabetes, you're going to want to consider your 7 to 10 servings per day and go heavier on those non-starchy vegetables, say 5 vegetable servings, and limit your fruit to a smaller amount, say 2 servings. Now, fresh is always a great choice with fruits and vegetables, and frozen can be a great choice too. Be careful of frozen vegetables that may have added sauces. Butter sauces or an Asian sauce will often have some added sodium or fat. Canned vegetables and fruit can also have added sodium or sugars. So we can look for no salt added canned vegetables or no sugar added canned fruit. Dried fruit can be some of our fruit servings as well. However, dried fruit is more calorically dense. Because it's had the water content removed when it was dried, it becomes a more concentrated source of natural sugar. So the portion size for both juice and fruit is a little bit smaller, about 1/4 of a cup. Now I do want to avoid adding any high-fat foods or fats when I'm preparing my vegetables. An example of this would be like a cheese sauce on my broccoli. Now I still get the vitamin C from the broccoli even if I cover it in cheese sauce, but the broccoli no longer is a low calorie density food when I do that. When I add something like a cheese sauce, or I batter and deep fry my summer squash, or I pour a lot of salad dressing on my salad, when I add that fat, which is very high in calories, I lose that low calorie density benefit of the vegetables. So we want to try to limit those added fats and sugars when we think about our fruits and vegetables. Now, a few tips to try to increase our fruits and vegetables throughout the day to try to get to that goal of 7 to 10 servings would be, number 1, start out gradually. If you are only eating 1 serving of fruits and vegetables today, please don't go out tomorrow and eat 10 servings of fruits and vegetables. you'll likely have some gastrointestinal discomfort and be a little unhappy with me. And that's because the fiber content is so high in our fruits and vegetables. So gradually increase your servings to gradually increase your fiber intake. You could start out by aiming to have 3 servings per day, and then maybe increase it to 4 or 5, and so on until you get your goal. Also, start early. Think about having a cup of fruit with breakfast every day. If we start out our day with a cup of fruit as part of our overall breakfast, then we're already 2 servings into our goal first thing in the morning. Also, double up. If you're going to take the time to steam broccoli or roast Brussels sprouts, don't have a half a cup, have a full cup or even more, and that doubles up your serving. Use fruit as a snack. That's another easy thing to do. If I have a banana as my snack at work during the day, think about it. It comes in its own carrying case. It's easy to carry to work and leave sitting on my desk. It may even replace a less nutrient-dense choice that I might have made otherwise. For example, if we're tempted by donuts in the break room, but we choose a banana instead, not only are we getting a lot of potassium and important nutrition, but we're avoiding the added sugars and saturated fats that would have been in the other snack. Whole grains can be a great source of fiber, as well as important minerals and B vitamins. So our recommendation is to consume 4 to 6 servings of grains per day, and we want at least half of our grain choices to be whole grains. When grains are processed, and most of the grains we eat are processed to some extent, but when they're heavily processed, they lose a lot of the important nutrition and fiber that was located in the outer layer or the bran layer of the grain. So to identify if a grain is a whole grain, there's a few things we can do. One, we can look at the ingredient list on a package, like a package of pasta or bread. We want the first ingredient to have the word whole in it. So 100% whole wheat flour listed as the first ingredient, as opposed to enriched flour. When we see that word enriched wheat flour, that means the wheat flour was processed, the bran was removed, and they had to enrich it or add back some of the important nutrients that were lost. Unfortunately, they don't usually add back the fiber, and they don't have to. So when you lose a lot of fiber when you choose something that's made with enriched flour instead of the whole grain flour. Another trick for choosing higher fiber and whole grain choices is to actually look at the fiber content. We want about 2 to 3 grams of fiber per slice of bread, or 5 grams of fiber per serving of cereal. Those would be considered high fiber choices. And of course, we'd want to limit our grain choices that have a lot of added salt or sugar or fats. So for example, boxed macaroni and cheese. While technically that's a grain, it also has a lot of fat and quite a bit added sodium in it. The last 2 food groups we mentioned can both be great sources of fiber. Fiber has some important functions in our body. It promotes fullness, which can help with weight management. Fiber helps to promote bowel regularity, which is always a good thing. It can help lower cholesterol levels. It can slow digestion of carbohydrate foods, which can help with blood glucose management. And all fiber helps to feed gut bacteria, which can help promote a healthy gut. There are actually 2 types of fiber, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. It is the soluble fiber that helps to lower LDL cholesterol levels. It actually binds to cholesterol in the small intestine and prevents the cholesterol from entering the bloodstream. It can absorb water and fatty acids to form a gel-like substance during digestion that helps to keep the bowels moving and lower cholesterol. Now, when we look at a nutrition label, we just see fiber listed. So we don't really know how much soluble or insoluble fiber is there. There's usually a little bit of both. So I have listed a few foods that are high in soluble fiber, like oats and oat bran, apples or legumes. For example, 1 serving of oatmeal or oat bran has about 3 to 4 grams of soluble fiber. 1 cup of black beans has 5 grams of soluble fiber and 17 grams of total fiber. Now, our fiber goals are 20 to 35 grams of fiber per day. Now, this range is based on your calorie intake. So people with a lower calorie intake would be at the lower range, around 20 to 25 grams per day. But people who eat a larger amount of calories would aim for the higher end of the range. Now, fiber is only found in our plant foods like fruits and vegetables, grains and legumes, nuts, beans and peas and lentils. And the more processed the plant food is, the more fiber we will lose during the processing. So the more unprocessed plant foods we can eat, the better. For example, fruit. If we eat the whole fresh fruit, we'll be consuming all of the fiber that originally came in the fruit. But canned versions of the same fruit will lose some of the fiber. Typically, they peel the fruit before they can it, and the canning process itself may destroy some of the fiber. Fruit juice, the ultimate processed version of fruit, typically doesn't have any of the fiber left. Remember also to, again, increase your fiber intake slowly. Start by adding about 2 to 3 grams of fiber per meal to help prevent any gastrointestinal issues. Our next food group is animal protein foods. This would include poultry, like chicken and turkey, fish, meat, like beef and pork, as well as eggs. Now, animal protein sources can be a source of saturated fat, depending on their overall fat content. So we most often want to choose skinless white meat poultry or fish from this group. And that's because they tend to be lower in overall fat and therefore lower in saturated fat, where your beef and your pork may be higher in fat. I want you to also notice the recommended number of servings, 8 to 9 servings per week. And a serving would be about a 3-ounce portion of chicken or pork or beef. 3 ounces looks about the size of a deck of playing cards. 8 to 9 servings per week is a lot less than what we typically eat. So when we think about the heart-healthy diet, we're going to be decreasing our emphasis on animal products, but remember those fruits and vegetables? We're increasing our emphasis on both plant foods and plant protein foods. That's an overall premise of the heart-healthy diet, a more plant-based diet. The reason we limit animal foods in the heart-healthy diet is because they are a potential source of saturated fat. Higher fat meats will typically have a lot of saturated fat. So for example, if we looked at ground beef, if I look at a 93.7 version of ground beef, which is 93% lean, 7% fat, it would have about 3.5 grams of saturated fat, where a higher fat ground meat would have more like 10 grams of saturated fat. Now remember, our limit is 12 to 15 grams for the day. The higher fat meat isn't going to fit in our day and keep us within that limit. Where skinless white meat poultry, like a chicken breast, would have 1 gram or less of saturated fat. That's going to fit a lot easier. There are some tricks that we can do when we do choose other meats like beef and pork to find the leanest version, and that's to look for the word round or the word loin in our cut of beef or pork. We can also trim away any visible fat or poultry skin to help reduce the fat content. Processed red meats like bacon, sausage, salami, or hot dogs not only will have a lot of fat content and potentially saturated fat, but they'll also have added sodium from the processing. So we want to try to avoid those. The American Heart Association does recommend 2 to 3 servings of fish per week, especially the oily fish. So your oily fish would be your salmon, your tuna, your trout, even sardines, mackerel, and herring have healthy fats in them. Remember, fish is the exception to that rule that animal foods will typically have more saturated fat. When fat comes from fish, it's the omega-3 fatty acids, or mostly the omega-3s, which are a polyunsaturated fat. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that shows that omega-3 fatty acids can help to lower your risk for cardiovascular disease and particularly death from cardiovascular disease. We also want to make sure we prepare our meats in healthy ways that limit adding a lot of saturated fat or trans fats. So we want to bake, grill, broil, stew, stew or roast, if we do add any fats when we're cooking meats, we want to try to add a healthy plant-based oil like an olive oil. When limiting our animal protein intake, we may find that we're eating more plant-based proteins, like nuts and nut butters, seeds, and legumes, like beans and peas. All of these are great sources of plant protein. They also provide magnesium and potassium, as well as fiber. And we don't get any fiber in our animal protein sources. Most plant sources, like legumes, also won't have any saturated fat. Now, some of these foods may be calorically dense. This would be our nuts and our nut butters and our seeds. These foods, while great sources of nutrients, are high in fat. They are typically higher in our monounsaturated and our polyunsaturated fats, the good fats, but that still makes them very calorically dense. For example, a fourth of a cup of walnuts has about 200 calories. And nuts are usually something that people have a hard time limiting their portion of. So we can see how quickly the calories would add up. If I ate a half a cup of walnuts, it'd be 400 calories. And of course, this is going to affect that calorie balance we talked about earlier. So when we choose those nuts and nut butters and seeds, just be careful that we have portion control. Another thing to think about in plant protein is if we choose a plant protein product that has been processed. So what I'm thinking about here would be like a frozen black bean burger or a frozen garden burger. Because they've been processed, they may have added sodium in them. Sometimes these can be a great alternative, but we always want to check the nutrition label. Sometimes these products will have saturated fat. There is a plant source of saturated fat, and that's tropical oils, which would be our coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oil. Palm oil is often added during processing and might be in some of these plant-based protein foods. It's added for flavor as well as helping to combine the ingredients, but it may increase the saturated fat content. I just want us to be cautious. Sometimes these can be great choices, but it always is a good idea to check that nutrition label, looking both at the sodium content as well as the saturated fat content. Dairy products also come from an animal, so there's the potential for saturated fat. This is why we would recommend the lower fat or non-fat versions of our dairy products, like skim milk or 1% milk, or lower fat yogurts. Full-fat dairy can have a lot of saturated fat. So for example, an ounce of full-fat cheese can have 5 to 7 grams of saturated fat. If our daily limit is 12 to 15 grams, that's a significant amount. Dairy is going to be an excellent source of calcium, really one of the best calcium sources in our diet, as well as providing protein and vitamin D and potassium. Some dairy products may add sugars. Your yogurts often have sugar to sweeten them. So instead, we can look for yogurts that are unsweetened or use stevia or sucralose, which is Splenda, to add the sweetness. We can also look for cheeses that have less sodium. Sodium is added during the processing of cheese, but our Swiss cheese and our fresh mozzarella cheese tends to be lower in sodium. If we can't tolerate milk or dairy, almond milk is a good alternative. It actually provides a little bit more calcium than cow's milk does, however, it will be lower in protein. Fats and oils are the fats that we may add to food when cooking or to provide flavor. Examples include the olive oil we cook with, the butter we put on our toast, or salad dressing we put on our salad. To help maintain healthy levels of LDL cholesterol, we want to choose unsaturated fats most often. Fats, like oil or butter, will always contain both saturated and unsaturated fats. But fats that come from plant sources, other than tropical oils, tend to be higher in both mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids and lower in saturated fat. Where tropical oils, coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oil, as well as fat from animal sources such as butter, cream cheese, or bacon grease, will be higher in saturated fat. Most salad dressings and mayonnaises are made from a plant-based oil, So they'll be higher in unsaturated fats. However, they will still have a small amount of saturated fat. All fats are calorically dense. A tablespoon of even a healthy oil like olive oil provides about 120 calories. So limiting the total amount of fats and oils is important to help maintain the calorie balance that's necessary for weight management. Trans fats, which we would previously see in stick margarines, shortening, and some processed snack foods or baked goods, are actually worse for us than saturated fat because trans fats can raise LDL levels and lower HDL levels. Most sources of trans fats in our diet previously came from partially hydrogenated oils. These were liquid oils, which were mostly unsaturated, that underwent a process called hydrogenation or partially hydrogenated. They did this to change the texture of the oil to make it solid or to increase the shelf stability. When they completed this hydrogenation process, they created trans fats. Now, a few years ago, the FDA actually banned partially hydrogenated oils, and manufacturers can't use them anymore. And this essentially removed most, or if not all, of the trans fats from our foods. So most of the time, if you look at the nutrition label today, you'll see 0 grams of trans fats. And that's good because our goal for the day for trans fats is to avoid them completely, if at all possible. To stay within the recommended sodium limits, which remember are 2,300 milligrams or less per day for everyone, and 1,500 milligrams of sodium or less per day for those wanting to better control their blood pressure or help with fluid retention issues. To stay within these limits, we have to think about foods or sources of excessive sodium. We won't be able to avoid sodium completely, but we want to avoid foods that provide a lot of sodium at one time. So when I think of excessive sources of sodium, there's 3 things that come to mind. One is the salt shaker. Salt has 2,300 milligrams of sodium in 1 teaspoon. So if I'm in the habit of salting my food, or if I use a lot of salt when cooking, I'm going to exceed those sodium limits pretty quickly. So I want to get out of the habit of using the salt shaker. Now, salt does provide flavor, so I'll need to add flavor in other ways, like spices and herbs, lemon juice or lime juice. Mrs. Dash and other sodium-free seasoning blends are available to us. And remember, your taste buds adjust. So as you start to reduce the salt and use other spices for flavor, you may miss the salt at first. But given time, you'll start to enjoy the taste of the food and won't miss that salt anymore. Once we get rid of that salt shaker, we have to also think about other sources of sodium. Processed foods can have a lot of sodium. So we want to limit our use of those convenient things like box side dishes, like macaroni and cheese, or flavored rice or flavored noodles. Processed meats have a lot of sodium, so using fresh meats in place of processed meats can cut back a lot on our sodium intake as well. Condiments and sauces can be a significant source of sodium, like soy sauce or mustard or ketchup may have a lot of sodium. Salad dressings have a lot of sodium as well. So we can limit the amount of these. We can make homemade versions of some of these things as well to reduce the sodium content. And then limiting frozen dinners, canned entrees, and canned soups. Trying to cook more from scratch if possible. Now, cooking takes time and it takes effort. So we may want to try what I call cook once and eat twice. If I cook a from scratch meal, it might take me a while, but if I cook extra and I save some in a bag that I put in my freezer or a container I put in my refrigerator, then the next time I want it, I don't have to cook. Things will keep in your refrigerator for about 3 days. If you want to keep it longer than that before you eat it, try putting it in your freezer. It should keep there for about 3 months. We can always look at the label. My general rule for sodium is if it has 140 milligrams or less, that is considered a low sodium food and is a good choice. 300 milligrams or more, leave it at the store. All of these tips are going to help us stay within these recommended sodium limits. And the last one is restaurant foods. All restaurant meals, even when we try to make healthy choices at the restaurant, tend to be very high in sodium. So if we eat out less often and cook from scratch more at home, that's another great way to reduce our overall sodium intake. If we would like some additional information on the heart healthy diet, the American Heart Association does suggest 3 different diets or dietary patterns that fit nicely into these recommendations that we've been talking about. The first one is the DASH diet. DASH is actually an acronym for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And this is a diet that emphasizes fruits and vegetables, as well as low-fat dairy, lean protein, and limits added sugars significantly. This pattern helps to ensure an adequate intake of 3 particular minerals, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, because intake of these minerals can help to lower our blood pressure levels. The DASH diet also limits sodium to 1,500 milligrams per day. The Mediterranean dietary pattern is a dietary pattern we're probably familiar with. There's a lot of information out there about the Mediterranean diet, and this is a pattern that's based on the diet of the countries along the Mediterranean Sea back in the 1960s. Studies had found that there was such a low incidence of heart disease in these areas that they studied their dietary pattern. And what they found is they ate a lot of the oily fish. They lived on the sea, so it makes sense that they would have a lot of oily fish intake. It was also very rich in fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains. The fats that are used with the Mediterranean diet tend to be the monounsaturated fatty acids that we find in olive oil or nuts. The Mediterranean diet is very low in processed meats or red meats. About 1 to 2 servings of beef or pork for an entire month would be an appropriate frequency. It's also very low in refined grains and added sugars. The vegetarian dietary pattern is another pattern that's recommended by the American Heart Association. The vegan diet eliminates all animal foods. That includes dairy and eggs, where the lacto-ovo vegetarian diet includes dairy and eggs. A vegan diet will be naturally very low in saturated fat because it does eliminate animal sources. We would want to be careful to still limit tropical oils on a vegan diet. And it will typically be high in fiber because of all of the plant foods that we're eating. If you want some additional information, you can always go to the American Heart Association's website. It's down there at the bottom of the screen. And I also included a link that had some information for the DASH diet. That's actually a very large document. I think it's about 64 pages, but it gives you menus and recipes and lots of ideas for heart-healthy cooking.